Hey everyone, we're so glad to have you back on the podcast today. We are talking about betrayal at the hands of faith leaders, and we have a really special guest who we're super pumped to have a conversation with. Ryan Ramsey is a writer, chaplain, and soul care provider who focuses in the areas of religious abuse, advocacy, and grief support. He's published in places such as let's see, how do you say it again?
Ecstasis.
Ecstasis. I already knew that and I just couldn't even remember, such as Ecstasis Magazine and Fathom Magazine. You can follow him on social at R Ramsey Writes, and he's also writes regularly on Substack. So he actually has an article coming up shortly this month on betrayal. So we are really just feel sobered and also thankful that there's people to communicate and delve into this really dicey, sometimes deeply painful part of our stories. And we just want you to know as you're listening that this is a safe place. And we do think probably a trigger warning is appropriate just because of the topic we're talking about, and just to care for yourself, to prioritize that as we go into this conversation. So, hey, Ryan, welcome again.
Thank you so much. So glad to be with you guys.
Oh, we're honored to have you.
Yeah.
And like Lauren said, sobered to have this conversation because it is a hard one, but just thankful that you're willing to be that safe person and just with a honest, sober eye, just talk about this topic of that this is real. Because I think a lot of kind of gaslighting happens with this topic within the church and spiritual places. So we just appreciate your availability and honesty just to come in and just affirm, and we can learn from, and as a whole learn from and just discuss this topic. So we appreciate you being here.
Yeah. So we'd love to just start off with more about you. So you're a new friend, new connection for us and for our audience. And we'd love you to just tell us about yourself, about your story as a faith leader, and how betrayal intertwines with your journey.
Sure. Yeah, these days you can find me in the world of chaplaincy in healthcare, as well as providing some soul care and grief support, specifically to victims and survivors of some sort of religious or faith-based harm, rupture, abuse. I'm doing a little bit of all of that. Sort of in two different arenas, but yeah, I ventured into the world of chaplaincy in the last few years. Prior to that, you would have found me in pastoral ministry in church context for over a decade. So, a lot of years of ministry, and sadly, along with that, part of my journey vocationally, career-wise, and the journey with my wife KJ is that we have lived and experienced abuse in faith settings. And for me, I'm willing to share that includes 2 resignations over years. So they say fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, right? Unfortunately, we have seen sort of the dark underbelly of some of the betrayal and harm that can happen in faith contexts. And as you guys know, I'm sure, contexts where you expect and presume there would be belonging, safety, and integrity. And I probably don't have to persuade you guys or your listeners that that's not always the case. So the things I find myself thinking and writing about and talking about a lot these days are about many of the themes that I have experienced and lived personally.
Wow. It just I just feel physiologically, there's a response of just hearing your story and experience of like my body response of sadness and grief for you and your KJ.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
also a sadness for the fact that there is a career that you have gone into to help people that have been hurt by the church. And if we grow up in the church, we know like the greatest commandment is to love God and love others. And yet we've missed that so significantly. And also selfishly, there's like a not aloneness, like, whew, like, because if you do experience spiritual betrayal, abuse, hurt, it feels very alone in times. And so, so there's a mixture of emotions that go on in me of just sadness for you and KJ and just our listeners, and also just re-feeling it for myself as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for saying that.
I think so much of like art and expression is, like you said, I find myself giving from what I'm healing from what I've experienced, from what I'm knowing at a deep level. And I just think the world is so much more beautiful and more hopeful because of people who create out of that space, whether they write songs or whether they write or whether they dance or just all the ways of expression to convey these deep gut level truths that are almost beyond. It's like there's not enough words to string together to communicate the depth of them, and yet we try. And it's a beautiful act of resistance, act of love. Just so thankful. Every time I see one of your quotes come up on Instagram, I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, yes. And man, this guy can write. And I'm always like showing it to Luke because he's not an Instagrammer. And he's like, wow. So yeah, I'm feeling it too, Luke. My body is definitely responding to that little short snippet of your story that you shared. Wow. One of the things
I found, I was just going to say in response, if that's okay, part of what writing, and I think this is probably true for a lot of us, right? Whether it's writing or some other art form, writing can be a way of healing. And so I think for a lot of us, we write or we express ourselves in some way to revive our voice, right? Or to regain our voice. And that's certainly been true for me. I think something has sort of been revived as I've given myself permission to write about not just my experience, but the experience of so many folks that I find myself walking with and journeying with.
Yes,
absolutely. And as Lauren was saying, like different ways of expression, and I just picture that came in my mind is the expression of sitting with people, like the way you express it, yes, in writing, but also the sitting, to making space. That is also a beautiful expression of your story and just truth. And so,
and like a partnering of stories together, which is so that co-regulatory effect of being with another that can be with you. There's just nothing quite like it. It's such a gift to the world. So something you said, I would love to just spend a minute on. You mentioned, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me, right? Is that how it goes?
Yep.
And I feel, and I don't know how much of this is my own story, so I'd like to say what I feel from that, and then kind of what it means to you, of just the vulnerability of hope and trust. And then when you like put yourself out there in this very naked, vulnerable way, in relationship again after seeing how harmful relationship can be, especially in certain contexts. And then it happens again. There's a unique shame that I have grappled with, have been pushed down by because of that little slice that you shared. So I would just love to hear what that's like for you.
Yeah, it certainly resonates, right? Because to experience abuse in a church or congregation or organization one time, is like, it's one too many, but it's like enough. For most of us, it's enough pain for a lifetime. And so to live that once and then offer yourself into another community, in my case, for another job opportunity, and come to find out that it wasn't a safe environment either. It wasn't the same kind of environment, but it was not a safe environment either. There was absolutely shame, I think, especially in the immediate aftermath of resigning and leaving that community, because I'm going, what did I miss? How in the world did we not see this, during our interviews, when we met people in the community in the beginning, right? You're asking all those questions, and there was absolutely a feeling of shame, or just almost like, I guess confusion.
Yeah.
It
Does
almost
disillusion, sorry, Ryan.
disillusionment, sure. And there's a little bit of disillusionment with yourself, because you kind of walk away saying, I don't know if I can trust myself anymore.
Yes.
Or as a family, can we trust our own judgment? Like, what is it about us? Right. So yeah, we absolutely had to grapple with those things. Of course, in time, eventually, I think we sort of found some equilibrium, in dialogue with others, where we don't blame ourselves for choosing to enter into another community and finding out it wasn't safe. There was so much actually that we couldn't know in interviews, and there was a level of pretense that prevented us from seeing everything in the beginning. And so, I think today there's a lot more compassion with ourselves, but absolutely shame at first.
Like, as you're describing that, it just reminds me of the episode of toxic loyalty versus healthy commitment. Like, we go into new communities because we've been trained to trust, to forgive, to have hope, to not trust our gut. There's one other thought that was there. Like, we use the word, we didn't come up with this, but coercive conditioning, that we have to believe that this next opportunity is good, and that was unique, because if we don't, then we're judgmental, then we're arrogant, then we're pushed out of the community. We lose community. We lose so much. And so it's not, on this side, I can see like, oh, okay. Yes, there's shame, but like, okay, there's reasons why it wasn't just fool me once, fool me twice, fool me 6, 7 times. Like why was I always hopeful? And it's like, looking at it from that way, it's like, oh, I had to be. I was trained to, I was told to, I was taught to, I was raised up to be toxically loyal and not even prioritize my experience, my feelings, my hurt. But to push that aside, and that was a sacrifice for Christ, and it's the suffering that we need to do to be sharpened and to be refined. And it's like, oh my gosh, that's toxic. So that's kind of the thoughts that came up to my mind as you were saying that, is, and how sad that that happens, and we suffer from the abuse or the shame of, and take on ownership of it. Does that resonate for you?
It does. It does. Yeah. And as you were kind of saying that, I was thinking, you know, I think another significant ingredient in our story was that when the second community, the second church, and the second job opportunity came around, we were very motivated to find ourselves in a new community and to have stability again in
Yes.
our work. And so our livelihood was a huge factor, a huge ingredient. And so I do think there was a lot of emotion at play in terms of, yes, this could be finally the landing place where we can heal. This can
Yes.
be the community where we're welcomed and we're not cursed for confronting abuse like what happened in our first community, you know. And in the interviews, that's the message we got, right? It was like, you're the family, you're the person we need, you're exactly the kind of leader we need. Right. So man, that really pulled on our heartstrings.
Absolutely.
Right. And
Absolutely.
so those were big ingredients for us too, looking back.
Wow. Wow. It shines a light on so many facets of the different types of vulnerabilities we can come into. So the person in ministry or volunteer work or missionary work, relief efforts, all of those types of things, they can come in with not only having the desire for connection and relationship, which is primal, which is how we're wired, the need for attachment, but then the additional layers of, oh, and you also need a livelihood, meaning, purpose, direction, stability, security, like layers, just so many freaking layers.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've already talked about it, but let's see if there's any more on your mind of some of the elements of faith leader betrayal. What else can this look like, or some unique aspects of this?
Sure. Yeah, I know you guys are familiar with spiritual abuse, and you talked about it. I think the experience of betrayal in a faith setting and by a faith leader, it can be varied, of course, but at its core, it's some sort of profound rupture of trust in a relationship, and often includes a significant violation, right? Or injury, and that often includes abuse. As you know, the abuse itself can come in many forms. Right. Spiritual is a broad sort of umbrella term in faith environments, but often underneath that umbrella is psychological, emotional, sometimes physical or sexual abuse. So all of those things sort of encapsulate the betrayal, but and maybe this warrants some further dialogue, but the more that I spend time thinking about it and reading and learning, I feel like for a lot of folks, and this rings true for my story, there's a little bit of a distinction between the harm, the abuse, the acts of abuse, the incidents, the events, the memories of injury, which can be devastating by themselves. But then there's the betrayal, and often the betrayal is sort of coincides with the grief. It's this haunting memory and realization that you were functionally discarded or erased or forgotten or neglected by usually not just a faith leader who was entrusted with so much authority and responsibility, but so often, right, it's also the community around that leader. And
exactly.
there's silence. So so much of the trauma and wound of betrayal is that haunting experience of silence or neglect by a community, not just a leader, right?
Yes. isolation is what keeps people, like we talked about in the episode, it keeps people in line, keeps people from not questioning, not challenging. You're just pointing out on the layered aspects of this type of abuse. I mean, all abuse is layered. Can you speak to some like specifics of like sexual abuse, physical abuse? We can kind of have that picture, but like that power dynamic and how it can be used for like psychological and emotional. One of that is what you just talked about, is the ostracization or the isolation or the
Othering.
In the community. But what are some other ways that it can be so
Insidious?
insidious and unseen,
Often subtle, right? A lot
right,
of subtle
so subtle
components.
that a lot of times we don't even see as abusive, but something doesn't sit with us, but we just go on with our life. And
that's
could
right.
you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think oftentimes in an abusive faith environment, you will find some sort of paradigm, often operating, it could be operating in the language or the doctrine, but there's often an invisible sort of paradigm operating that has to do with power and how power is sort of stewarded and distributed in a system. And I would say most of the time in an abusive faith setting, authority and submission are sort of the name of the game, right?
Yes.
And so you may have, I found this is part of the crazy making confusion, but a lot of times you will find sort of rhetoric about family or community, sort of shared and spoken rhetoric, but in function and in practicality and in terms of how power is distributed, often one person, maybe it's a senior leader, has that most, if not all of the power in that system. That's usually a very powerful personality. It could be a very charismatic kind of, stereotypical bully who's sort of holding so much sway in the system and uses fear and intimidation. And that sort of takes shape and operates in a very sort of stealth way, to your point, right? There can be sort of obvious expressions of verbal abuse, yelling, raising voices, that kind of stuff. But so often abuse sort of envelops a system in a very subtle way, in that people just come to learn without any spoken agreement. They come to learn that I better not cross these lines. I better not challenge this leader because I know what will happen to me if I do. And so there's a sort of an unspoken contract of deference, submission. You're not allowed to question or raise concerns, or you face, severe consequence. And so to add one more layer, in a faith setting, right, often what you get is not just this sort of invisible power system or structure, but you also get language from scripture. You get language from sacred texts about what it means to be a community, or what it means to be a faithful member of that community. And again, often what you'll find is this really, really heavy emphasis on submission to authority, and that functions as a means of silencing dissent, and also a means of avoiding control. The possibility of accountability is what I was going to say, but control.
That is perfectly said.
If you can put something that you're saying is higher than you. So say I'm the charismatic bully, but I'm saying, oh, well, our sacred text I'm even accountable to it. It's the ultimate authority. And if you can set it up and posture it like that, when really you're the one who's above it, because you're the one who is, I'm the one who is using it in such a way as to be the authority, and manipulate it and use it as a tool of coercion, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, it's set up that, well, we're all following it, you know, the leader's following it just as much as the people. And it's this almost like Twilight Zone reality, because you don't know in your body, like your body knows, like Luke said earlier, something's not quite right. You see it maybe in the fruit of this person's life, but the premise that everyone's already agreed upon, you can't question the premise, is that it's above the leader and we're all following it. And so if he's telling me, oh, it's such a recipe for truly control, manipulation, and domination, like you said. It is, it makes so much sense now that fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, fool me three. Now that all the times have happened, it's like, oh, this makes so much sense now. In the middle of it, and for those of our listeners who are like not there yet, no problem. It can feel as confusing as heck, because it does. In the middle, it feels like everything is foggy and is thick and is pressing down on you, suffocating you from being able to breathe. Because that's how upside down it becomes when you start questioning these strongly crafted systems. But yeah, it's set up in the hands of unsafe, unhealthy people. It is going to be set up to be absolutely used, not in your favor, but in the system's favor.
Yeah, that's right. You might hear things commonly said by a leader or board or group of leaders, right? Something to the effect of, I didn't make the rules. It's in the text. It's in the scripture, you know?
Yeah.
And so, the manipulation is just something to behold. But part of what we're getting at, as we describe kind of the dynamics, is in the aftermath, right? When people are reeling from this kind of harm, the depth of that wound of betrayal, you know, it's not just that relationships get ruptured and shattered. Oftentimes it's the whole worldview. It's the whole foundation of a person's faith, what they have held dear their whole life, right? It all gets ruptured.
Absolutely. And what have you seen to be the impacts of that kind of betrayal and that kind of rupturing on a person's life?
Sure.
Faith,
yeah.
Relationships, community.
Right. Well, you know, just in terms of the trauma, it's not uncommon for victims or survivors to never be able to step foot in a building again, right? Or a congregation, because of how triggering that experience is. So there's the physiological and physical impact of, I can't step foot into a sanctuary again. It's too painful. It's way too loaded. But then there's all of the, I think, relational and then theological aspects of the betrayal, where in some ways, if you just think of a massive tornado that rips through a community, when you experience this kind of thing, it's like you're looking around after a huge tornado has wiped out your whole world, and you're just looking around at debris and a flattened landscape, and you're trying to figure out where to start, you know. How do I move forward after this? And so it's comprehensive in nature, right? Some people walk away from faith entirely, and I totally understand that. And for other people, it's really just slowly, one piece of debris at a time, picking up the pieces and saying, hey, what do I do with this? I don't even know what to think or believe about this anymore. How do I think about community again? Or gathering?
Ryan, I love that you just said that tornado imagery.
That's a great imagery.
That was just my mind instantly created that vision, and it resonated. I'm working on this writing project, and one of the lines in the beginning is, how do I find true north when the compass is in pieces among the debris? And it just, it went so well with, because this idea of it all tumbling down.
Right.
And it is so hard to articulate why, if you haven't experienced that, it's so hard to explain how profoundly leveling that is, like you said.
And disorienting.
That image is helpful because people have seen footage of this quaint little town that had all its ducks in a row, and everything worked functionally, and everything knew who was what's the roles, what's the expectations, how's the system work, and then bam, the tornado leaves nothing in order, in functionality. It's just destroyed, decimated. And so I think that imagery is probably a good takeaway for people listening to this episode that haven't personally experienced this, which is probably not many people, but just to help understand and have empathy for those who have, because if you haven't had your town leveled, you can imagine how hard it would be to rebuild after your town was gone.
Yeah. And I think you're touching on a little bit of aftermath trauma or abuse of when somebody is questioning then after the abuse, like, ooh, I don't know if I can go back to church. I see this posting all the time, like, people are hurting you, and you left the church, people hurt you. It's not about the people. You should love Jesus, or you put the people ahead of Jesus, or it's just like,
those are my favorite.
Oh my gosh, like you're missing the point. That when you minimize, like if you, we'd never see a city demolished with a tornado and say, well, that's not really your reality. Like, you're just pretending like your house was destroyed. Stop making things up. Like, the house next to you is fine, so it must be your house is fine too. Don't you know how this works? That can actually happen. That doesn't dismiss the fact that my house is destroyed.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so
the minimizing and the gaslighting, oh man, is so damaging, right? I've heard the refrain so many times, perhaps from some well-meaning people of faith, but they sort of look from the outside at someone who's been victimized or crushed and say, well, maybe you need to get back in church. That's got to be the answer, because you've isolated yourself and you're just wallowing in your pain. And so get back in church. So many heavy-handed, dismissive messages that come, right? And what does that do for the victim or the survivor? It just reinforces that these are people who I can't trust, and I don't know how I can belong to anymore.
Right. Yeah. And I think you again touch on another point of so much of this abuse is done with quote unquote good motives. But that's why we want to have this conversation, is to help people understand, one, to affirm the people who have experienced this and help them walk through it, but two, people who haven't, to understand, like, even with the best motives, if you're still responding with dismissing it, telling them to suck it up, using scripture against them, using shame, like, this is not loving. To also understand the system, the importance of the power that leadership has, and they need to take it seriously and not use it for their own motivation, goals, achievements, ego. And for people that are in the system to see it and say, hey, I saw that. We need to shift. We need to do something different. This is harmful. Ooh, I said that to somebody before. I should go apologize to them. I didn't realize what I was saying. The hope is not to shame and to, we don't want to shame on the people who are hurting people, but we want to bring light into those hurts and what people and how people are being hurt, so that there can be a shift in a new way of doing it, and a right way of doing it, a loving way of doing it, in an honoring way. So I just want to bring humanity to, I don't know if humanity to even the ones that are doing the hurting, for the purpose of change. Like, we're just calling for change. We're inviting for change. We're inviting for a better way, a new way, a healthier way, a more loving way to interact with people, to prevent abuse, and then to help people recover from those who have been abused. Does that make sense? Am I saying that right?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to read a quote by this really awesome guy, Ryan Ramsey, and see what this really awesome guy, Ryan Ramsey, thought of his quote. The stories and sorrow of those victimized by religious abuse deserve the church's esteem. Too often they receive indifference or scorn instead. Regardless, the voices of the crushed echo the voice of love, who is moved with swift affection by every lament. Like, what a sigh that brings to those who have experienced harm. It is, why are these voices met with indifference, Ryan? Why is there scorn instead of
he said it
care?
so much better than I did.
You said it great.
When you have time to write and redraft and erase and edit, right? It's the luxury of writing and publishing. You were asking why. I mean, I think part of it is just, to your point about the humanity of people, I guess, is sometimes we just respond in our own anxiety, right? We just respond because we feel uncomfortable about someone else's pain or their grief, or perhaps if you're a person of faith and you see someone sort of protesting, lamenting their abuse, you feel like this impulsive, perhaps knee-jerk, well, the whole church isn't all that bad, so, or you often hear victims are told to move on, right? And I do think that often just comes from someone's own anxiety and inability, sadly, to just sit with that pain and lament of a victim. But I also hear victims and survivors say too, how do I move on? But I think that's coming from a little bit of a voice inside them that says you should move on. Why are you still thinking about this all the time, right? And that's often shame. But from a grief lens, I always want to say that moving on is not the goal. I think honoring your pain and your grief is the goal, and inviting people into that experience. You actually, maybe you're still feeling this so intensely because other people need to continue to bear witness to what you've lived and honor your story, and that rage or that fury or that sense of outrage, why that exasperation, that angst, that's all part of the experience of grief. And that all is very sacred. And that needs to be honored. If you're a victim or you're a survivor, I think you may feel it because you haven't been adequately witnessed yet.
Reminds me of the quote.
Yes.
Every pain on earth longs for a benevolent witness. And we have definitely seen that to be true in our own stories of harm and in the stories of harm of those we walk with. And I love that invitation you just gave, Ryan, that there's nothing wrong with you if it still feels like the days it happened, or the days you realized it, or if it still feels as fresh can be. That's an invitation to find some safe places to not navigate the immensity of that grief alone, because it's really just, I would say it's almost impossible to carry that level of grief completely alone.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was real quick, just gonna say, it reminds me of another quote I read yesterday. It's not gonna get it quite right, but just the idea, the quote was, I want, stop feeling like because you keep on feeling overwhelmed or feeling pain, that means you haven't made progress, but you're making progress because you're feeling overwhelmed in the pain. So like part of grief, like you were saying, the whole process of grieving is feeling the weight of it. And so if you're feeling it and that shame's coming in and saying, why am I still here? Why am I still feeling this? You're still feeling it because your body's saying you still need to grieve. And that's whole process of feeling the full weight of it in order to move on is your body has to work through those emotions. And so just encouragement that if you feel overwhelmed still, if you still feel those emotions, that's because you're still need to grieve and you're still in process of grieving. And as you move through it, it's not like it's going to stop, but it'll be lighter. You won't be overwhelmed by it. You won't feel so overwhelmed. So like I think the tornado was so recent, like the destruction is still so present.
Right.
And so, yeah, just the encouragement of that's normal.
Exactly. Yeah. Healing takes the time that it takes. And oftentimes we put sort of timestamps or time limits on our journey. And so, yeah, it's not uncommon. I mean, with any trauma, but it's not uncommon for victims of betrayal in a faith setting to be looking up a year out, right? A year later and saying, gosh, why am I still so debilitated and so angry?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
2 years out, why am I still so angry?
Yeah.
And again, they often receive messages from someone that says, have you considered that maybe you've become bitter about this? And those are needless to say, damaging, dismissive messages themselves, re-traumatizing. That's exactly right. Yeah. But again, I want to go back to, it would be dishonest not to feel angry given what you endured.
Yeah.
It would be dishonest not to acknowledge that the betrayal you faced tastes so bitter, because that's what it is. It's toxic and it tastes bitter, and it takes years to get that taste slowly out of your body and as you heal. But I think people survivors and victims, I think we all need to do our part to encourage those victims and survivors that giving voice to their pain is part of the journey. And sometimes you need to be able to do that without filtering your protests, right?
Yep.
This is how we heal. The problem, right, is there aren't too many people, unless you're a therapist or a safe friend, there's just not enough people who are willing to enter in to that experience with the victim.
Absolutely. And as you were talking again, the tornado analogy came up of like a time frame. Like a lot of people who have been hurt have been in the church for decades. And so like all that you've built up to that point has been destroyed. So it's not going to take 6 months to rebuild that. It's not going to take 6 weeks to rebuild that or to find safety. And so if you look at it from even that perspective, there can't be a timestamp. It's just of it takes time to rebuild things, and as different people have different capacity, different resources to rebuild something, and it's going to just be, it's your own story and your own path. And some people might have a counselor to talk to, and I say friend, and some people might be doing it alone or not have the resources, so it's going to take them longer. And so just like that comparing, that's also where we can get stuck, whether we're looking from the outside or even looking, being the abuser, like, oh, they got over this so much quicker than I did, or they seem to be moving on. And that's tricky from the outside. Like, well, did they do the work, first of all? Or what kind of the leveling, like we can't see it from the outside. So just that compassion for yourself and curiosity in that process. Compassion is so important for yourself. If you can't receive it from others, giving that gift to yourself to be on your journey.
Yeah, and I love that Ryan said that earlier when you were just sharing about your story, how or it was a bit after that, just how you're able to be a lot more compassionate now.
Yes.
Realizing you didn't do anything wrong. You couldn't have known. And moving forward now with a different posture towards yourself, that makes me wonder, how else do you think people can heal? What can it look like? Maybe some things that have been helpful for you, or what could this road look like rebuilding?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that question. I would say one of the things I commonly hear from victims of religious abuse and betrayal is something to the effect of, I wouldn't say that my entire faith was destroyed, but I certainly would say that I don't trust institutions anymore. And you often hear that sort of distinction where I held on to my faith, but I can't trust institutions anymore. And so healing, to your question, I think for a lot of people is being given the permission to imagine life and community in ways that may not include a serious investment in an institution again, or a church. It's being given permission to think, okay, what would it mean for me to invest in community, even spiritual community, in a non-institutional setting? And I think that is huge for a lot of people who say, I want to hold on to something here that's still valuable to me about my faith, but I can't do it in the context of an institution again. And so I find myself having those kinds of conversations a lot with people, and being willing to discuss and imagine and dream with them about maybe there is a chance and a possibility that you can still experience community, but it doesn't have to be in those four walls, in the context of those four walls again. And so a lot of people just need permission. A lot of people were told growing up, no, I can't do that. I can't. If I leave the institutional church, then I'm no longer in.
That's right.
And I don't hold to that view. And I think especially from a lens of trauma, people need to be given permission without shame to slowly reimagine community apart from an institution. Maybe I'm not saying that's everyone, but for a lot of people.
Yeah.
That's important. I think another thing related that comes to mind is just people feel understandably overwhelmed about the prospect of starting over. I lost my community. I lost this whole group of people who were once like my quote unquote family. And now I don't even know where to begin. And I think first I want to lament and grieve that for a lot of people, like that means their relationships have been leveled to zero, you know. For those of us who have friendships, long-standing friendships or community, like it's such a grace and a privilege. The reality for so many victims and survivors is relationships get leveled to zero, and so starting over, literally starting over, is so overwhelming. And yet I think there is an invitation, and it's an invitation to courage, to invite people one relationship at a time or one friendship at a time to let yourself experience being known again. And that may begin with a therapist, right? But it may begin with one new friendship that has the opportunity or chance to blossom into something beautiful and safe. I think I want to invite people to think on those small scale terms, especially victims, because it's too overwhelming to think about jumping into a new church or a large community where you're the the new person in the group. That's often too much to start with. So small scale invitations to pursue relationships again, even that I fully acknowledge is a source of grief, because right there are so many victims, and I just talked to one this week who were like, I just can't do it right now. I tried to make a new friend and it didn't work out, and I'm just so exhausted by the vulnerability of starting over. And I do want to honor that grief. Anyway, so I'll pause there. I've got some other ideas too as far as healing, but I did want to at least mention the whole idea of community.
I just love what you just offered. And I just hear your heart and your compassion for and love for people, and how safe you are, what a safe person you are, and why you're doing the work you're doing. And so thankful for you. There's just that permission, that invitation, that compassion, that lack of urgency. If you're just like joining in with them, just walking with them, it's just beautiful. It is. So thank you for sharing that. It was encouraging, and even spoke to me, and I know it also to our listeners. I don't know if we have time for, you said you had more. Love to hear more. Do you have anything you want to say, hon?
No, I echo what you say. It's super clear that you're trauma informed and that you're using that lens to know how to proceed wisely. And I think so that's so much of what's missing in this conversation is people may have the heart to help, but they don't understand trauma. They don't understand its effects and how it physiologically works in the body. And therefore they say things like, well, just get back in, just jump back in. You need people.
Get back on that bike.
It's like the second wound. I really like that expression of, the first wound of initial abuse is beyond devastating. And then the second wound can sometimes even be worse when you can't find safety. You can't find restoration. You cannot find repair. So I guess I did have something to say, but now I'm going to stop because I want to hear, thanks, your few other thoughts on healing.
Yeah. A lot of survivors find real community and encouragement online. And, for all of the ills of social media, there is a very robust survivor and victim community on social media, and people
Yes.
have been profoundly encouraged by that space. And so, you can find that on Instagram, Twitter, wherever people are, they're there. And I have found a real synergy and life to that community because there's this sense of togetherness,
Yeah.
albeit limited because this is digital
Sure.
life, but it can turn into real life opportunities and embodied community. And I've seen that happen over and over and over again where people connect online first. So that's a beautiful, rich space, I think, for victims. Of course, you have to kind of curate your experience so that you're not re-traumatized on social media, so that you're not absorbing too much, that kind of thing. But I wanted to mention that. And then this is a little bit more maybe ambitious, but my wife, KJ, and I are becoming more and more impassioned about the idea of grief ritual. And this would probably be a whole nother podcast, so I won't go into too much. But I think there's beautiful opportunities to hold space, even in a very small group, in the form of grief rituals, gatherings, to sort of make what you've lived, make your story, honor it with some sacred space, give it some symbol, give it some elements, whether it's a bonfire or a hike outside or something around water, and imagine various ways to experience ritual. And I'm really captured by that these days. And I think there's a beautiful opportunity for survivors to experience more healing through grief ritual.
That's really cool. I like that. And I've actually become more curious about that recently. So maybe we will have you on again for that podcast, because I have a lot to learn about grief rituals and seeing the significance of them and the importance of them as we walk through grief and grieve, celebrate the grief by just giving it the attention it deserves, but also moving forward and celebrating. So
Yes.
very interested in that.
How disconnected Western culture is from anything ancient and grounding in that way. We just we don't have access to it. And so I think the closest we get to that is a really meaningful conversation about it, as that little moment and bubble in time of honoring that. But how neat would it be to bring, like you said, more symbolism and more tangible effects into that process as you're being witnessed, as you're being held, as you're grieving together. I mean, it sounds like it sounds amazing. I was gonna say like one of those psychedelic experiences that people are experimenting with, but I didn't want people to assume that I was doing that, but I have read some about it.
Yeah. Part of the irony of us even sort of talking this way right now is that the idea of grief ritual is as ancient as humanity itself. You kind of just mentioned that, right? So like the indigenous tribe or village would be listening in on our conversation going, of course you do grief ritual. We've been doing this for generations, right? This is how we grieve. This is how we heal as a community. And Westerners in particular, we just don't have a category for it.
We don't. I was listening to a talk by, I don't know if you know him, Gabor Mate. Have you ever heard of him?
Heard of him.
Okay. I was watching a talk on him.
Guy.
Yeah. And he was actually talking to, I can't remember where, but it was an indigenous people group. And that's what he was saying. It's like they have specific things for different grieves, like rituals that they do and how to grieve, and they do it as a community, and it's just he was just talking about the importance of it as people, and how we have lost that. A lot of us Westerners have lost that.
We have.
significance of grieving as a community and doing different rituals and stuff.
I love
And
that you threw
so
that in
to that
there
word.
because it makes like, oh wow, Ryan's so mysterious. What's he talking about? I love when there's like these other layers to people that maybe are unexpected, or it's like reading a good book and finding out, oh, grief rituals. What is
Yeah,
this?
totally.
Stay tuned.
KJ and I are totally novices in this area
Mhm.
ourselves, and we're actually experimenting. We're going to try and facilitate our first little grief ritual this fall with a group of people that will include some beautiful hiking and aspen season, and so
Oh wow,
we're excited about
cool.
it.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we're running out of time. Ryan, thank you so much for your time, for coming here again, and all of just the beautiful love, compassion, insight, sharing your experience, sharing invitations. Just, I know it was a blessing to me. I'm sure it was a blessing to our listeners. As whether it's spiritual grief or abuse or other abuse, like grief, it all needs to be grieved, it all needs to be witnessed. But we're just talking today specifically about the spiritual abuse, religious abuse and betrayals. And so, but thank you for bringing your insight, your professional knowledge and experience. And we're just so honored to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much. It's been beautiful to be with you guys, and I'm grateful for the work you guys are doing too, and the way that you guys are holding space and educating, and I'm honored to continue to champion the beautiful work you're doing.
Appreciate that.
Thanks, Ryan. And if you want to find Ryan, just a reminder, he's on social at R Ramsey Writes. And yeah, connect with his stuff there because it will be a powerful encouragement to you, I'm certain.
Absolutely.
So thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you next episode.